The MIDI protocol has been with us for nearly 40 years, and as with all the best inventions of all time, it's about solving very simple problems and actually in a simple conceptual way. Let's take a look. As I said in the introduction, the basis of MIDI is very simple. It solves a straightforward problem in a straightforward way. Now, this is an Atari ST computer from 1988, and in it you have one of these. It's a floppy disk drive. Now, computers like this also had MIDI in and out as standard. You can see these two ports here, an in and an out, and then various other things as well that you can connect stuff. And the idea was that you stored your song as digital information, as MIDI information on one of these. Now, this says 1.44 megabytes. That's tiny. You know, kids are growing up with computers that have gigabytes and terabytes of data that you can store on them. But there's the rub, you see. If you're recording audio, you're using huge amounts of data, whereas back in the day, you could record an entire song, which would be a few kilobytes. So you could get an entire album's worth of MIDI material on this one disc. Now, 1.44 megabytes equates to about 10 seconds of digital audio at 24-bit 44.1 kilohertz that we're used to recording on our computers. 10 seconds versus a whole album. So you can see where the concept went and how it essentially revolutionized music. I have a keyboard here, and on the screen you can see Logic Pro X, which is a familiar looking display to most people who have an Apple computer. And essentially, the way that MIDI works is exactly the same with this computer as it was with my Atari. How's that then? Well, MIDI works with 128 things. 128 notes across the MIDI range, 128 different volume levels that you can play them back at, and maybe 128 different instruments on a particular device that you can address. So everything was 128 things. That's really important because actually 128 different volume levels is really quite impressive. Now, the equivalent of a computer playing a keyboard is what would happen if you were sat in Carnegie Hall and there was a Steinway Model D grand piano, this 9-foot grand piano, hundreds of kilograms of wood and iron, beautiful thing. However, it's completely useless if it's sat there on its own and not played. It doesn't mean anything. You need a pianist to come and play it. Now, the pianist is the equivalent of the computer, implying, just basically imparting data onto this piano, such as when the notes go down, when they're released, and the volume levels, and of course things like the sustain pedal as well. So piano represents the most simple concept of MIDI. You have a note on, and then that note is released. Between those two things, there was a velocity level or volume level. At the top of the display here, you can see in this particular part of the display, there's something called no in and no out. You think, well, what's that mean then? If I play that middle C, 4 things appeared. There was a note, a classic musical note, which implies that a note has been played. And then there was a number 1, which is the MIDI channel. Now, there are 16 MIDI channels, not 128. There are 16 MIDI channels, so you can have 16 instruments essentially playing back from a computer, and you can feed lots of different things. It's a bit like a radio. You tune your radio into a particular radio station, and all of those stations are broadcast by the, in the airwaves. So you have your C, you have your note, channel 1. Then you have C3. Well, it's a C, and it's the 3rd octave in MIDI terms. If I play the C above, you can see C4 there. The number after it, 74, 19, 4. That is the volume level. So if I really hit it one, I get the maximum of 127. Now, the dynamic range available on these sort of MIDI pianos is not perhaps as dynamic as that Steinway Model D in Carnegie Hall, but you can get a long way with it. If I play a chord, I can get all of that dynamic range simply with a MIDI keyboard. I probably only transmitted a few tens of kilobytes of data there. If I'd recorded that in audio terms, so onto a CD recorder or a pair of audio tracks on the computer, I probably would have, I suppose that was about 20 seconds of playing. That's roughly 2.5 megabytes in stereo, or 3 megabytes. So hugely more than the MIDI equivalent. Now if I record this, if I just press record, I made a few little fluffs there, but here's the advantage. Of course, you can go in afterwards. If I double click on this part now, that's what I've just played, and you can see all of the colours that are associated with velocity. Now, on the dear old Atari, of course, it was black and white, so you couldn't see that, but they had other ways of showing that. There was a little display at the bottom which showed how loud each note was, which was perhaps more intuitive. Don't know. So you have your sort of blues at the quiet end, and then reds at the or oranges at the louder end. Now you can see at the moment that I played to a click track, so I played to the 120 beats per minute metronome that I had. The advantage of this, of course, is that I can slow the tempo down. I can simply say, okay, I'm going to play it at 95. So it's played it back slower, but it hasn't changed the sound. You can see how much of a boon this was back in the day. Now, at the moment, I've played with that metronome, so my timing is going to be slightly different from that metronome. It'll be ever so slightly different. There are people who play almost to the wire, and of course there are, places where you might think, oh, that note was a bit late or a bit early, and of course you can quantize this. Now if I go into this and select all of the notes, I'm going to quantize it to 1/16th note. Why am I going to do this? Well, I'm not sure I really want to, but the first chord, as you can see on here, actually comes slightly before the bar, as a bit enthusiastic to start. So instead of quantizing everything, if I do that, you can see that all of the notes move very slightly. In fact, I'll undo that so that you can see it in terms of the page. There we go. You could see that all of the notes were moved to the nearest 16th notes. Now, this does mean that things like this, you can't have spread chords now, because it'll just be that. So if I play back from the beginning now, didn't really sound all that nice. Whereas if I unquantize it, if I go to edit and undo quantization to reveal what I had before, perhaps maybe I could quantize only the first few notes. So that because I actually started, there we go, and that one as well. I actually started the thing a little bit early, whereas if I just quantize that first note, it means that my part will begin at bar 3. Now, there's a little note in there that I didn't want. That one. Oh, and I didn't want that top D either. Oh. There we go. My part has emerged unscathed, just with a few little editing tools. You can change the velocity as well, the volume afterwards. You can change the pitch afterwards. If I wanted to take all of this lot, and I was playing in C there, let's say I wanted it in D flat, just move it up a semitone. D flat major is a harder key to play in on the piano than perhaps C would be, if I had this. But, it's more tricky. So if you have a pianist who's happier in C or D than D flat, of course you can record those parts. You can even transpose on the fly so that when you hit a key, it's actually the new note. People like me with perfect pitch, that becomes a bit of an issue, but you can just record and then correct afterwards. Now, also, I had a sustain pedal here. The sustain pedal transmits its own MIDI data. If you look at the display at the top, you can see a down arrow with 3. So I'm transmitting on channel 3 as a sustain, and you have controller number 64, and then either 0 or 127. 127 was sustain pedal down, 0 was sustain pedal up. So of course you can actually look at these sort of things. Now I can change the sustain. If I just want to look at the sustain pedal, it transmits its own MIDI notes. So if I just go to the automation on Logic, and you can find this in various, musical digital audio workstations, it just appear in a different place, but the concept is the same. We've got sustain here. There we go. Just going to look at the sustain pedal, and you can see the movements of the pedal. So for example, at the top, now this is where it's slightly confusing, because at the top is where the sustain pedal is down, and at the bottom it's where the sustain pedal is up. So that's first bit, for example, is the sustain pedal switched on, which is why you can hear all of the notes building. And then as I changed that chord, I lifted the pedal and then put it down again. Now this is what a pianist would do, otherwise you have something like this. So that whole tone romp there actually made it sound a little bit dreamier. But what happened there was that all of the notes were left sustained, and you wouldn't want that. You don't want that at all. In fact, it's even worse on an acoustic piano where you're generating the overtones because of the physical nature of that instrument. So you can go in and you can change all of this sort of data. You can get rid of that sustain altogether. So, or rather the lift and back down. So this will basically sound like I just demonstrated. But actually, I almost prefer that. Now, when you are playing back, if I'm slightly in a different place from bar 3, if I start there, for example, it missed that first note out. And you think, well, why has it done that? The answer is there was no note on message. It could only see the notes, but there was no message to say play them. So what you can do is you can actually do something called chasing notes. Now this is where if you play back in the middle of a note, you can actually still hear those notes. So essentially it's moved the note on message to where your cursor was. So under chase here, you can go chase notes. So if I go back to that same place, so I put the cursor back to the same place as it was just now. So just literally a 16th note in, it'll play back exactly as it would have done on a tape recorder, for example, where you can hear the tail of the note. Now, of course, it plays the beginning of the note, so it doesn't sound quite that realistic. You can see what can be done with this. Now, of course, you can change the swing, for example. If I select all of these notes and actually set the swing to 66, for example, it didn't do it. Why not? You can change all sorts of aspects of it. You can look at the 16th notes, or we could actually quantize this to swing, for example. If I went to here and quantize this up to, I don't know, 8th swing D, for example. That's the different strengths imply different strengths of the swing. So an A swing is really almost indistinguishable from straight quavers, whereas if you've got the F, it's really strong. And you can make your own quantization levels up. If you play swing in a particular way, you can program that up and make sure that everything's quantized to it. But I would be very careful with quantization. Only do it if you absolutely need to do it. Now, of course, if I decide that I want a different instrument, I don't want the piano, maybe I want an electric piano, this is where the MIDI really comes into its own, because you just go, okay, well, I'm just gonna play it through an old Fender Rhodes instead. Easy. Easy, easy, easy. And of course you can make everything quieter or louder by selecting all of your notes, or indeed doing a MIDI transform where you can limit everything to a particular velocity. If you've got a heavy-handed keyboard player in the studio but they're quite good at the soft notes as well, you can limit everything so that it's, you know, the louder notes are brought down a bit. It's a bit like compression in audio terms. So MIDI, it's hugely capable, massively capable, and actually a real boon for anybody in a studio.